When Bobby Curley is taken to hospital with unbearable pain and delusions, the doctors are unable to determine the cause of his ailments. His condition deteriorates rapidly, and the medication he is given does not serve its purpose, but actually kills him. Bobby Curley was a young man, 30 years old, who always wore a smile on his face. He married a young widow, Lisa Kopek, who had a 4-year-old daughter. After the death of Lisa's first husband in a car accident, Bobby and Lisa had been friends for a year. They had a beautiful wedding. Bobby was also ready to get married and start a family. He told me that he really loved her, and I was happy for him. The couple moved into Lisa's apartment on a quiet street in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Bobby works as an electrician for the Morgan Company. He has just been given a big job at the local chemical company. Before we went there, we had been told that the labs were supposed to be cleaned out and empty. Well, when we went into the lab, we found all sorts of vials of chemicals that had been spilled and other materials, and I thought that could be dangerous. 3 months into the project, Bobby falls ill. His brother noticed one evening that something was wrong with him. After just 1 beer, he wanted to go home. He said that he didn't feel well. His feet were burning and hurting for some reason. He couldn't walk well, but I didn't know what was wrong with him. We worked on the 3rd floor, and when he came up in the afternoon, he had a bright red face and was sweating. He didn't look well at all. We were working in the lab, and I asked, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "I don't know, I'm completely out of breath. I just don't feel well." Bobby also complains of numbness in his hands and pain in his feet. At the hospital, the doctors diagnosed Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare disease characterized by numbness and weakness in the limbs. Although it can be dangerous, most patients recover. Curley shares his hospital room with Richard Bonin. I remember once when the nurse pulled the comforter over him and touched his skin with it. Bobby wanted the blanket removed immediately because it was causing him pain. He was just in so much pain that he didn't want to see anyone, not even his family. That's how much he suffered. Bobby's condition gradually improved, and he was even discharged from hospital. But the pain came back, and this time it was even worse than before. He couldn't even get up to go to the bathroom. Then he looked at me and said, "Please call an ambulance." He knew he was really sick. This time Curley was taken to another hospital about 160 kilometers away. When he got there, he was so delusional that he had to be strapped down. I thought he would eventually get better, but he got worse and worse. He couldn't sit, lie down, or do anything at all. Everything bothered him. The doctors here suspect that he has something more dangerous than Guillain-Barré syndrome. The dramatic change in his condition makes us suspicious, because that doesn't happen with Guillain-Barré syndrome. It comes on within a few days, and then you recover quickly. But here it was protracted. It couldn't be this syndrome. Although Curley's blood tests are all normal, Dr. Donovan has his suspicions. And if he's right, then Bobby Curley's dying. He notices something that was previously overlooked. Bobby's hair is falling out, along with the weakness of numbness in his limbs and the severe pain and burning on the soles of his feet. The doctors diagnose arsenic or thallium poisoning. Thallium is a classic metal poison. It is toxicologically similar to other metal poisons, such as arsenic or lead, and leads to classic symptoms of poisoning. A characteristic feature of thallium poisoning is the loss of hair after about 2 to 3 weeks, not individual hairs but in clumps. A special urine test confirms the fatal suspicion. Thallium can build up in the body for months before it takes effect. There is no antidote. My first thought was whether I could save this patient. But by the time I was involved in this case and the diagnosis had already been made, there wasn't much left to do. And I remember him pointing to his diplomas and awards on the walls and saying, "None of this can help your brother." He said there was nothing more we could do. Your brother is going to die. On October 20th, Bobby Curley falls into a coma. When there were no more signs of brain activity, the artificial respiration was switched off. We all said goodbye to Bobby and left. I couldn't watch Bobby die. It wasn't easy. I talked to him. Who knows? Maybe he heard me. We don't know. It was a bad time. The autopsy confirms that Curley died of potassium poisoning, most likely a very large dose. But where did the poison come from? The Department of Labor's Division of Workplace Safety is now trying to determine whether Curley was exposed to thallium while working in the chemistry lab. His colleague believes the work was not without danger. In one lab, I found a cloth that said thallium wipe, touch me and die. And I remember that Bobby was already ill at the time. He warned us not to go into a certain room, me, Joey, and the others, because there was thallium poison there. So we didn't go in. A spokesman for the chemical company denies that there was any thallium residue in the laboratory. However, he admits that there were 5 bottles of thallium in the warehouse. Thallium can be ingested, absorbed through the skin, and inhaled. In all 3 cases, one is exposed to poisoning. To find out whether thallium was accidentally ingested by the workers in the laboratory, Health Officer Susan Chauvelin takes air, dust, and dirt samples of all kinds from around Curley's workplace. Lisa Curley also tells the investigators that her husband brought a few cabinets from the lab that were no longer needed. The cabinets are also tested for thallium, but all the results are negative. And none of the other electricians who worked with Bobby Curley in the chemistry lab were found to have thallium in their bodies. Lisa Curley also takes a thallium test, and both she and her 4-year-old daughter Angela have thallium in their bodies. It wasn't enough to cause symptoms. We didn't have to treat it either, but it shows that they were both exposed to an unusual amount of thallium. The health department investigators then investigate the Curley home and find thallium residue in 2 thermoses that Bobby took to work every day. They usually contained iced tea. I didn't know who put the thallium in the thermos, but I knew someone did, and that caused his death. And when someone causes someone else's death, that's murder. Who could have an interest in Bobby Curley's death? Who had his long, agonizing murder in installments on their conscience? When the police find traces of the poison thallium in Bobby Curley's thermos flask, they question his work colleagues. They ask me how well he got on with the other guys or if there were any arguments, etc. Bobby Curley was only 32 years old when he was appointed foreman for the job in the chemistry lab. His promotion meant that older and more experienced electricians were passed over. The investigators also found out that Curley was sometimes the victim of bad jokes. His colleagues sometimes mixed spices into his food as a joke. Curley was one of those people you could joke with. Hot pepper in tobacco or something like that. And we assumed that someone might have inadvertently slipped thallium into his iced tea, thinking it was Valium, just to find out how it affected him. Curley himself also took part in such pranks. For example, he drilled small holes in drain pipes that plumbers had just installed. I'd worked with these guys before, but they wouldn't play pranks with chemicals. We played little games like hiding tools, etc., but we wouldn't mess with food or anything like that. They were screwed. The investigators were at an impasse because it just didn't make sense that fellow workers would try to kill Bobby. None of the workers had a motive. Bobby was their foreman. They worked for him, and the relationship between Bobby and his colleagues was by and large positive. They accepted him as a very good electrician, and above all, as a good supervisor. This piece of the puzzle simply didn't fit here, so we didn't need to look any further. We had to look in a different direction. When the investigators examined the thermoses in Curley's house more closely, they also found thallium residue on a small bottle that Bobby never took to work. His wife Lisa remembers that her husband once brought a thermos bottle home from work that still had some iced tea left in it, so she poured the rest into the small thermos bottle. Lisa says that she and her daughter may have drunk this iced tea later. That would at least explain why thallium was also found in their organisms. But it doesn't explain who put the poison in the thermos. Or maybe it does. Bobby Curley's parents and siblings expressed their suspicions to the police. They explained that the marriage between Bobby and Lisa was not as happy as it seemed in the first few months. They even consider it possible that Lisa could have had something to do with her husband's death. As a result, the district attorney ordered Curley's body to be exhumed for a second autopsy. Forensic toxicologist Dr. Frederick Reeders was particularly interested in examining Bobby Curley's hair. When a substance like thallium circulates in the bloodstream, tiny residues of it stick to the root of the hair. Thallium remains on the hair stem even after the hair grows out. A hair grows an average of 1.3 centimeters per month. This means that a strand of hair can have a medical history of 6 months or more. Toxicologists, such as Professor Gerald Covert, can derive precise statements from this biological fact. Hair analysis for toxins also offers the possibility of creating time profiles of toxin ingestions by examining hair elements one after the other and plotting the respective measured values, and then determining, for example, whether an intensive toxin ingestion took place 3 or 5 months ago. Such a time profile is now being created with Curley's hair. The result of this segmental analysis of hair samples is alarming. Bobby Curley was exposed to the toxin thallium long before he worked in the chemistry lab. Bobby Curley received a small dose of thallium just 2 months after his wedding, a year before his death. Forensic tests soon provide the police with even more frightening evidence. It turns out that Bobby had ingested a very high dose even during his stay in hospital. A large amount was found in Bobby's intestines, and he received a very high dose shortly before his death. The concentration in his intestines was thousands of times higher than the concentration in his blood and other tissues. The investigators then initially ruled out as possible perpetrators anyone who had no contact with Bobby Curley during the poisoning phase. This was an investigation of logical exclusion, and in the end, there was only one person left who had to have done it, and that was Lisa. The facts are on the table, but the motive is still unclear. I think Bobby was very happy at first. But then, just a few months after the wedding, I wasn't so sure. Bobby made comments that sounded like he regretted getting married. They really didn't have much in common. He was more of a quiet type, and she let it rip from time to time. They were both very headstrong, and each wanted to get their own way. Certain conversations indicated that things were not going as they should. There was not the marital bliss that many originally assumed. The police find out that shortly after the wedding, Bobby makes Lisa the sole beneficiary of his $300,000 life insurance policy. Forensic tests revealed that the poisoning began about 2 months after the wedding. That was a shock. I couldn't believe it, as if she had planned it from day one. She started it when the contract making her the sole beneficiary was signed. The family remembers Lisa's strange behavior. None of us were able to go into the dying room and witness the ventilator being turned off. Only Lisa. She wanted to stay in the room and watch Bobby die. Even at Bobby's funeral, Lisa was not the grieving widow. Lisa didn't shed a single tear. When my mother cried, Lisa turned to her and told her to be quiet. Lisa Curley is arrested and charged with murder on December 12th. In the face of overwhelming forensic evidence, she pleads guilty. In American criminal law, a guilty plea allows for a significantly lower sentence. Lisa Curley thus escapes the possible death penalty. At the sentencing hearing, Lisa then publicly admits that she systematically poisoned her husband. In open court and under oath, Lisa Curley admitted to poisoning her husband over a long period of time. She publicly admitted how and when she did it and what poison she used. Lisa put thallium in her husband's iced tea more than a dozen times. Her confession matches Dr. Reeder's timescale almost perfectly, and I was frankly amazed at the parallels with her confession. I certainly wasn't proud or pleased about it. I was just very puzzled. When she was asked why she did it, she said, "I killed him for the money." Lisa testified that she used rat poison that she had found in her grandmother's cellar. The rat poison contains the deadly thallium. At first, she only put a small amount in her husband's iced tea. Later, however, she increases the dose because she fears that the poison might not work. Finally, Lisa finishes her deed in hospital. She gives her husband the last lethal dose of poison, an extremely high dose of thallium. She mixes it again in the iced tea she has brought her husband. She gives it to him when he is already dying. The fact that the same poison was found at his workplace at the same time as she poisoned her husband is a coincidence that allowed her to get away almost scot-free. Lisa Curley is sentenced to 20 years in prison.